Hi, can you see and hear me?
Good evening.
Good evening. I just wanted to answer Avi's question earlier. So RPM was approved on February 15th of this year. It was a contentious 3-2 vote by the Township Committee. The town's residents have never seen any of the other proposals. And I've requested some of the proposals via Oprah, and I haven't gotten all of them, so take that for what you will. As for my statement and questions, I've prepared a statement and I've highlighted the questions that I'd like answered. So I'll just do as Mr. Sacamendi did earlier. I'll read my statement. And then if people forget what the questions were in the statement, then I'll just go through the question. So I'd first like to get some clarification on how the agenda for the meeting was set and who determined that this particular document would be discussed here at this time, and when was this determination made? I searched through previous Township Committee meeting minutes, but I couldn't find any notice that this particular document would be discussed today, other than a link that appeared on the Township website with no additional qualifications other than meeting materials. I bring this up because there doesn't seem to be a well-defined process here. Given that this plan comes from Kyle and McManus Associates, shouldn't it be the case that the Township Committee reviewed it first and then referred it to this board for discussion? Since it seems this was not the process, what is the precise mandate assigned to this body by the Township Committee? Mr. Buzak, you made a statement at the beginning of this meeting claiming that proper public notice was filed, and I find this particularly telling. I'm sitting in this meeting today, and it's not even clear to me what the mandate of this board is. How is the public supposed to have known that this particular planning board meeting would be the one where this plan was to be presented and then voted on? How can you, in good conscience, say that this qualifies as a public hearing? This is an especially busy time for town residents as school is wrapping up, and it's particularly egregious that this meeting was scheduled to take place at this point in the calendar year. I can only conclude that Mr. Buzak's statement was meant for purely performative purposes to cover his own tracks and does not actually capture the spirit of public notice. Which, after all, I suppose that's the point. The less residents get to provide input, the better when you're trying to get away with selling some of the most valuable real estate in our town for a single dollar. So now I'm going to get to the plan. On page 1 of the plan, it states that the plan supersedes all previously adopted housing plans, including the April 2018 Housing Element and Fair Share Plan. If there's a conflict between these two documents, which document controls? Also on page 1 of the document, it states that municipalities have been assigned a specific number of affordable housing units. But these numbers differ between the April 2018 plan and this document under consideration. I'm an engineer by training, so I always try to understand and approach problems from first principles. The part that doesn't make any sense to me here is how the RDP number would be 17 units in the April 2018 master plan, and now it's determined to be 114 on page 2 of this document. Can someone give me a simple answer as to why this number changed? How exactly is it determined? How can these numbers change from one iteration to the next? How can it be the case that both of these documents are consistent? And why did the overlay zones go from 6 to 10 dwellings per acre up to 25 and then 40 dwellings per acre? Are you telling us that this is just a coincidence that the two zones that our two negotiators live in just happen to be untouched? And then now you're going to hide behind the excuse that this is confidential? This is not right. We don't live in a society where you can hide behind the curtain of confidentiality. On page 34, it states that there are minimal environmental constraints associated with the site of the 100% affordable housing development. This location is a town dump. You can call it recycling all you want, but the first hit when you Google Millburn dump brings you right to the DPW webpage. At the Township Committee meeting on June 7th, Alex McDonald stated that site investigation identified 6 to 7 areas of concern, narrowed down to 2, one of which was historic fill, the other was mercury. Site assessment is in full on the township's website. I've conducted multiple searches of the website and I still cannot find this fabled assessment. If this planning board adopts this document tonight, are you taking responsibility for this statement if in fact there are as yet unidentified contaminants that could lead to health issues for the residents of this project? This could be a huge open-ended liability for our town. Beth, you're claiming that remediation is by the developer. If remediation is not done properly, will the developer be liable for this in perpetuity? Because if we adopt this plan, our town is on the record saying that there were minimal environmental contaminants. Where is this in our agreement with RPM? Beth McManus, do you speak on behalf of RPM? Moreover, there are several questions related to the financing of this project. On page 6, the document states that On July 17, 2008, Governor Corzine established a statewide 2.5% non-residential development fee instead of requiring non-residential developers to provide affordable housing. Yet on page 39, it states that Millburn adopted a development fee ordinance just last month. There's a 14-year period where we were not collecting these fees. Why was the town not collecting these fees? On page 34, the document states that it is anticipated that the development will utilize low-income housing tax credits for the development. In order to qualify for these tax credits, it's necessary to run a pilot program. I've heard that the pilot program, as it relates to this project, was scrapped. So could someone please clarify if we are indeed still pursuing this as a means of funding this project? This is critical information, as it will have a profound impact on funding to our schools. Speaking of schools, as part of the master plan reexamination in December 2018, it states on page 40 that stakeholders indicated that the schools are at or near capacity, and it was therefore imperative that the municipality remain in constant dialogue with the Board of Education moving forward, as land use decision and changing demographics affect the district's long-range facilities planning. Has this dialogue happened with the Board of Education? What is the plan to address the influx of children that would be attending Millburn schools if the plan moves forward? If future studies find the land unsuitable to build on entirely, what is the town's obligation in that case? If they let this go forward and the settlement isn't finalized, isn't the town on the hook for providing that many units? And also, if this were a larger mixed-use development, would it still be eligible for state funds to build it? Because if not, wouldn't it make more sense to zone it for mixed use, and then a developer would have to pay out of pocket to build the units? Given the cost to build right now, perhaps they might not want to do so. That's the end of my statement. I have the questions highlighted in the document that I'm reading in case anyone was curious which particular questions I wanted answers to.
Okay, Mr. Hung, thanks for your statement, questions as well as comments. Just want to bring up 2 quick words as my reaction. While I feel that that was a very professional response and thoughtful, and you pose some questions which I do think have already been addressed. You also raise others which have not yet been addressed or may have not been addressed. I do just want to raise the word of respectfulness and just encourage all of us. We as members of the planning board, as you know, are members of our community. You didn't introduce yourself, so I don't know if you are a member of our community, but I do hope that is the case.
Yes, so I live in Short Hills.
Great, that's wonderful. So I just always encourage our board as the chair to speak respectfully to each other as well as those coming. So just as if anybody's going to be responding, I also encourage us to use respectful language with one another. So that said, I may turn it over. I don't know if Beth, you wanted to address with any initial responses or reference any answers which were already given. For example, I know you did raise the question, Mr. Kung, on the schools, and I think that was already addressed, that hasn't yet been studied, but a valid question to bring up. Beth, any other items that you wanted to address?
Yeah, I think there are a couple items that I can address. Some of these are in regard to questions regarding the notice and the agenda. Those items I'll have to defer to others that may be in attendance tonight. But there were other questions in regard to which document controls the 2018 Housing Element Fair Share Plan versus this 2022 Housing Element Fair Share Plan, which obligation controls, what policies are in control. As stated in this plan, this 2022 plan, this document fully supersedes the 2018 housing plan. So the obligation stated in 2018 is not the township's obligation. That housing plan, if and when this planning board adopts this 2022 housing plan, will essentially render the former housing plan irrelevant in the sense that it cannot be relied upon for policy or for determining the obligation. As part of that, one of the common themes in both plans is the fact that Millburn Township went through a vacant land adjustment. As was referenced by Mr. Kung, our RDP increased significantly from 2018 through well, through what you see in this 2022 housing plan, but really, this housing plan is not the document that determined the vacant land adjustment results, that RDP. That was actually done, as I had testified to in my presentation, that was done as part of the settlement agreement process. So the planning board does not have the ability to adjust that RDP tonight or through a subsequent meeting and change how it's addressed in the housing plan. But that said, it went up for probably a handful of reasons. As folks, I think, understand, I'm not the planner that drafted that 2018 housing plan, so I'm really not prepared. I'm not prepared to talk about the details of how that RDP was generated, in part because I didn't do the work, but also because, quite frankly, it's not relevant anymore. We've already settled on.
Why is it possible to change? There doesn't seem to be a process.
I understand you'd like to know why it changed. I'll explain that in just a moment.
Okay.
So as I started to say, I can't get into the details about what site may have been included versus now, but generally speaking, what happens during the settlement process is municipalities submit a vacant land adjustment to Fair Share Housing Center, and it's reviewed and maybe accepted or maybe adjusted through that settlement process. Adjustments that may have occurred in Millburn may have included the addition of sites. It may have adjusted densities, the affordable housing generation of each site upward. And the other thing it does is it incorporates sites that are going to be developed during the third round. So as we look to our the properties that generate RDP and the properties that satisfy the RDP, they are largely one and the same. So if we take, for example, just the Annie Says property as an example, that site I don't believe was included in your 2018 RDP. The site is one of our settlement terms. Its development of it is one of our settlement terms because it's going to be used to satisfy our third round obligation. Generally speaking, that means it's included in the RDP. So that's just one example, one specific example of how the RDP has changed. But I really want to encourage folks to understand that the vacant land adjustment of that Millburn sees reflected in its housing plan was actually completed and negotiated as part of a separate process. And that was your 2021 settlement process. This housing element and fair share plan simply reflects the terms of that part of the settlements.
So you're telling me that these terms were decided last year, and that was prior to any of the residents being informed as to what the contents of the settlement were. So you're basically just telling us this is what was decided, and you have no recourse as residents of this town. Is that correct?
I mean, I'm simply explaining the settlement process and the nature of it.
Right, but we're sitting here today. You're asking the planning board to approve this, but you're basically saying, no, planning board, you're just approving the settlement agreement that happened last year that no one knew the contents of.
That our elected officials and others were part of the decisions on that, as described earlier in this meeting. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. But so no one knew the content. Even the planning board didn't know the contents of what was being approved by the town council last year.
The settlement agreement was between the town council and Fair Share Housing Center. The planning board.
But the contents of the agreement were never made public to the residents prior to the township committee passing it. And this, I understand, our legal counsel has changed their tune of, because there was a meeting back in March, I believe, where our legal counsel, I don't remember if it was Buzak or Marizidi, they said they miscommunicated the confidentiality reasons. And so they were saying there was confusion between confidentiality of the negotiations versus confidentiality of the contents of the settlement. And those are two separate things. I don't want to conflate those here. So I am
really reluctant to take focus away from the planning board's task tonight, which is adoption of the housing element and fair share plan, and instead focus on settlement discussions that occurred in the prior year.
This was one of the questions with the town council. In my statement, which is, who determined the agenda for today's meeting?
I can provide some response to that because you also asserted that the plan had not been shared or discussed. That is not the case. In fact, Ms. McManus both presented at the last meeting 2 weeks ago, and that meeting was with a very similar presentation to tonight, was made available, and as all our meetings are, via YouTube, and it's all available to be rewatched. So it wasn't a matter of being snuck in or somebody being noticing it just to cover themselves, which is kind of the words and assertions you made. So I do want to clarify that for the record, that not only did we correctly notice and have the agenda posted.
I want to clarify what I meant. I didn't say that there was no agenda. It's not clear to me what the exact mandate of today's meeting is. So I understand on the minutes it says there's going to be discussion and adoption of this, but is there no back and forth? Like, if there's inaccuracies inside of the document, are those just not going to get addressed? So it's either you adopt it all in full today or you don't. Is that?
So this is why we had our first, the plan was presented to the board and circulated, and we had the opportunity to review. And then we're coming tonight with any questions if people have grammatical corrections, if that's sort of the content that you're talking about, or
so amendments are in order in terms of will there be, if there's something gravely wrong with this plan, I don't know, maybe the town isn't comfortable with saying that there's minimal environmental issues with the dump site. Like, maybe we're not comfortable with that as a town. Like, do we amend the plan and then we change it and then we adopt it? I guess procedurally, I don't understand sort of the purpose of today's meeting.
Ed, can you clarify? I don't think I'm answering it sufficiently.
Well, let me try it. I thought you did answer it sufficiently. The published public notice that was in the newspaper as required in the municipal land use law made it clear that we will conduct a hearing on this particular housing element and fair share plan, which was available at the planning board office. It was available online. And the notice further provided that the planning board had the right to make any adjustments or amendments to that plan at the public hearing and adopt the plan at the public hearing without any further notice. So I think that, the notice was perfectly clear as to what the charge was for the planning board tonight, what the agenda was going to be, and what the action that was to be taken was going to be.
So to be clear, it is possible for amendments to be proposed to this document based on feedback from public comment and then potentially passed with those amendments.
That is correct, with the caveat, because I don't want this to be misinterpreted, with the caveat that this housing element and fair share plan reflects the determinations that were set forth in the settlement agreement. As we've said now multiple times, both I said it, Ms. McManus said it. So, for example, the ability of the planning board to change density in a particular zone or to cut out properties in a particular zone would be, that is set forth in the settlement agreement, would be inconsistent with the settlement agreement. And that kind of amendment would not advance the housing element and fair share plan portion of the settlement agreement.
Okay, but the purpose of the planning board is to assess this document and see if it comports with prior documents that were approved by the planning board, e.g.
I don't
the
think
April 2018 master plan.
No, I don't think I've said that at all. I said what I said. I can't make it any clearer than I have.
Okay, so essentially the planning board, you're telling me and the community that the planning board's hands are tied because of the settlement agreement.
Those are your words, sir, not mine. I said what I said. You can interpret it.
Okay, that's my understanding. It's fine.
Okay. I just want to make sure we can get to all the questions we do have tonight from members of the public. But were there any additional questions that we haven't addressed of yours?
Will the developer be liable in perpetuity if remediation of the site is not done properly?
I don't know the answer to that question because I'm not involved in the discussions with the developer of that site.
I think that's a question that's not properly for this planning board. That's a governing body question.
But I think it's important to consider this because this plan, it says on page 34, there are minimal environmental constraints associated with the site. So if there are not minimal environmental constraints associated with the site, and someone down the line, 15 years, gets really sick from some unknown contaminant there, who is responsible?
Like I said, that's not a question for this planning board. It's not relevant to the housing element. That's something.
Well, I
that's
think the
subject
planning board
best
ought
for the
to
governing
consider,
body as part of their
everything in
negotiations
this
with the
document
developer.
prior to approving it, regardless of what happens at the township committee meeting. This is a document. You cannot pick and choose portions of the document that suit you. So
Thanks,
if
Mr.
this
Kung. No, I
document
think we hear
says-
you.
Okay, because
Thank
I don't want our community to be on the hook when, somewhere down the line they say Millburn Planning Board approved the fact that this site, it said minimal environmental constraints. I just want that on the record.
Thank-
So another question I had was, why was the town not collecting redevelopment fees until just last month?
So you don't mean redevelopment fees, you mean development fees?
Yes.
Yeah, the reason for that is the township was not able, we're not legally permitted to collect and retain those development fees. In order for a municipality to collect and retain those development fees, they have to enter through the court process, have a development fee ordinance approved, and either have a spending plan approved or commit to having it approved in the short term. Millburn had not done that until recently. The law that you're reading authorized or required a 2.5% non-residential development fee. But what the detail that you're missing is that municipalities were only able to retain, to keep those fees themselves if they went through this process. Otherwise, they're required to collect it and then send the money to the state.
Okay, I'll have to go back and read it in more detail.
Okay. Thank you for your comment.